So today we're going to talk about assertive communication. So we're going to be talking about how when you have to talk about something difficult, when there's a problem or an issue that you have to talk about with one of your soldiers or a family member, how you can talk about it in a way that not only increases the likelihood that that problem will get solved, but that way that you're speaking is putting money in the relationship bank. You're strengthening your relationship just by the way that you're speaking. So assertive communication is where we're going to start today. Now, go ahead and circle in your binders that assertive communication builds connection. Connection is one of our core competencies. As you know, we know that people who are resilient have strong relationships, they have connection, and that's what we're going to be working on today. And we also know that assertive communication is about the 3 C's, being confident, clear, and controlled. So we're going to talk about what each of those mean. What does confident mean? What does clear mean? What does controlled mean? All right, now let's start. So confident. Confident is about you as the speaker. If I'm having to discuss something difficult with my husband or a colleague, if I'm confident, I'm expressing just through the way that I speak, through my body language, through my eye contact, voice tone, all of that stuff, that I feel good about this communication, that I feel prepared, that I feel composed and ready to go. So confident is about the speaker. The second C is clear. Clear is about the message, that if you want to communicate assertively, you have to make sure that your message can be understood. You got to give the other person a fighting chance of understanding what it is you're talking about. So the message is clear. And we're going to talk about ways to make sure your message stays clear. So confident, clear. And the third C is controlled. And by controlled, circle the word tracking, if you will. Because what we mean here is that if I'm controlled in how I'm speaking, I'm paying attention to the person I'm speaking with. I'm making sure that he or she is understanding me. If something I'm saying seems to be bringing, a negative emotion, is making the other person angry or shutting the other person down, I'm going to kind of backtrack a little bit and make sure that my message is communicated in a way that the other person is with me in that message, in that communication. So confident is about me, the speaker. Clear is about the message. And controlled is about the relationship. I'm making sure that we're in this together. 3 C's. Okay. So let's talk about our model of assertive communication. You'll see that the model is ideal. And I'm going to take you through each of these components of the model, and then we're going to drill down into each separate section of the model so that we can talk about what are some of the things that might make us get off track in our assertive communication and how we can stay on track. So the first part of the model is identify the problem. Identify the problem. And you'll notice that there's a little dotted line under the I. What do you think that dotted line's about? Take a guess. Yeah, some more.
That you actually can't do anything with the problem until, you can't go through the model until you actually know what you're going through the model for.
Oh, so I love that. So before you're communicating with the other person, let's say I wanted to speak with Bob, before I'm going to speak with Bob, I'm going to, on my own time, that dotted line means do this on your own time. Don't cross over that line until on your own time you've tried to identify, and it also says understand the problem. Not just identify it, not just spot the problem, but you have to do a little due diligence. You have to, on your own time, try to understand what's this all about. So first step, identify and understand the problem, and maybe just write down in your binders that dotted line means this is homework, this is due diligence, this is, you do this before you start the communication. So that's I. Good. The next step of the model is D, describe the problem objectively and accurately. What do you think the key words are in that step? What am I going to tell you to circle?
Accurate.
Accurate. And why is accuracy important, son, darling?
so that you're making sure you're in the right lane, you're in the right zone.
Great, love that. So accurate is important because if I'm being accurate about the problem, the other person has the opportunity to get on page with me, to understand what's this about and why does it matter. So I'm being accurate about the problem. What else is a key word there? Yeah, Lieutenant Gordon. Why objective? Why does that matter? Lieutenant Gordon.
It helps keep the emotion out of the conversation and to keep subjectiveness out as well.
Okay, that's spot on. We're going to talk later about how emotion can get in the way of communicating assertively. So step 2 is to describe the problem objectively and accurately. Great. Next step, it says E, express. And by express, you'll see it says to express your concerns and how you feel when appropriate. So expressing your concerns is critical in assertive communication because this is when I say to the other person, hey, look, this is why it matters. We've got this problem, we've got this issue, and when I express my concerns, I'm letting the other person know why it matters, why they should even bother to have this conversation with me, why it matters to me, what my concerns are. And then my feelings when appropriate. We'll talk more about when it might be appropriate and when it might not be appropriate to express your feelings. So that's E. The next step is A. And you'll see for A it says, ask the other person for his or her perspective. Ask the other person for his or her perspective. Why do I need to, if I'm communicating assertively, and remember, trying to strengthen the relationship, that's part of what this is about. Why do I need to ask the other person for his or her perspective? What do you think? Yeah,
I just
Kevin.
want to make sure that I'm not trying to answer that problem or help the issue in a vacuum. That I'm cognizant of what somebody else thinks.
So I love that you've got to be cognizant of what the other person thinks. Maybe the way I'm perceiving the problem isn't wholly accurate. Maybe the other person has a whole different perspective on why this problem happened, or what the problem means, or what the real issue is. And so until I've asked the other person a question, asked the other person for his or her perspective, it's really not even a conversation. So jot down next to A, conversation starts. Because what I mean by that is, until I bother to say to the other person, hey, what do you think's going on? How do you understand this? Until I've done that, it's just me talking at them. And I need to make this a conversation because we're about strengthening relationships. So that's where the conversation starts. Now the other part of A, it says to ask for a reasonable change. Go ahead and circle reasonable. Why am I emphasizing the word reasonable? That you're asking the other person for a reasonable change. Why reasonable? Why is that the key word here? Yeah.
If it's not reasonable, then they can't achieve it.
Love that. So if it's not reasonable, the other person might not be able to achieve it. And a lot of times, I mean, think about the conversations you have. A lot of times, maybe we describe the problem objectively, and then we do express our concerns, and we ask the other person for his or her perspective. But then when it gets to the change part, we ask for things that the other person, even if they wanted to, couldn't make good on because it's an unreasonable change. So we're going to talk about why reasonable change is so important. Great. So we've got the I, we've got the D, we've got the E, we've got the A. We're at our last step. So L is list. And you'll notice on the slide it says to list the positive. What are the positive consequences, the positive outcomes that will occur if you and this other person are able to make these changes? How is it going to benefit your relationship? How's it going to benefit whatever it is the outcome you're trying to gain? So we're going to start by listing the positive. Why do you think we're emphasizing that you lead with the positive in our ideal model of assertive communication? Why lead with the positive? Yeah.
Because it makes both people in the conversation feel good about what was just talked about.
Great. Because if you lead with a positive, then both people in the conversation feel the positive emotion. If we make this change, here's how it's going to benefit us. That builds positive emotion, and we've talked a lot in MRT about the value of positive emotion. So we're going to start there. It's motivating. But it also says, if necessary, you might have to talk about the negative consequences or outcomes that'll occur if the other person isn't able to make that change. And that's fair game. That for some of the people you're talking with, they might be more motivated by knowing, and if we aren't able to do this, if you're not able to make this change, here's what's going to happen. So it's okay to list negative, but we're going to emphasize, let's at least start by trying to motivate people through the positive. So that's our ideal model. Now, let's take a little bit of a closer look at each of the steps of our model. So again, I identify and understand the problem. And as you mentioned before, this is on your own time. So the dotted line represents you're going to think about it ahead of time. And you'll see there's a number of MRT skills you might need to use to really understand the problem. So an example is maybe you've got a bunch of thinking traps going on. Maybe you're stuck in the them thinking trap. So you're seeing the other person as the sole cause of the problem. And that's not making it so that you're being objective and accurate. Or maybe you have an iceberg. Maybe the reason this problem is really bothering you is that it taps into one of your core values or core beliefs, an iceberg. So in your own time, you're going to use some of the other MRT skills to make sure that you're going into the conversation as clear and thorough about what is this really about? What's this problem or issue really about? And you've used the MRT skills to check your own thinking. So that's the I. Once you've done that, the conversation starts. And so let's think about D for a minute. D, remember, is to describe the problem objectively and accurately. Now, there are all sorts of ways when we're talking to someone where we go into the conversation with language that throws the conversation off course. For example, if I said to you, man, Sergeant Moore, you never, well, what is the deal with you? You never, ever do what I ask of you. Never, not once. What's the deal with you? What's the problem in what I just said? What did you notice about the language I used?
Puts them on the defensive.
Oh, puts them on the defensive, absolutely. And what in the words I used could put Sergeant Moore on the defensive?
Never.
Never. So I exaggerated. Never. And when you exaggerate when you're describing a problem, you might as well hand that person a get out of jail free card, because that person has every right to respond by saying, what do you mean I never? That's not true, just yesterday and now you're debating frequency instead of talking about the real issue. So we're going to, please circle, minimize exaggeration. When we practice this ideal model, when you practice this ideal model, we're going to be paying real close attention to your language, your word choice. And if you exaggerate, we're going to point it out to you, because as soon as you exaggerate, your conversation starts heading off course. So you're going to minimize exaggeration. And you're going to be specific and recent. You're going to talk about the recent time that this event or problem occurred. Because when it's recent, it's more relevant. People can think about it. It's relevant. It's something that's currently going on in your relationship. So that's D. And we're going to be objective and accurate. We're going to minimize exaggeration. We're going to be recent. And we're going to be specific in how we talk about things. D. The next is E. And remember, E is about expressing your concerns. So tell me again, why does it matter in our model of assertive communication to express your concerns? Why can't I just say the problem? Why do I have to say my concerns about it? What's the value of that? Yeah, Suzanne.
Well, it tells you why it matters to you.
When I express my concerns, hey, look, and when you do that, it concerns me because we're not going to be as effective. When I say my concerns, that ups the ante. That tells the other person, look, this is why it matters. And I need you to engage in this conversation with me because this really matters. So it's a statement that you make about why this matters and why the other person should care as well. Okay, so that's expressing your concerns. What about expressing how you feel? You'll notice it says on the slide, if or when appropriate. So when is it appropriate? What's the value in expressing not just your concerns? Look, we're not going to be as effective, that's a concern, but to also say how you feel. And you know what? And I'm worried about that. What's the value in expressing your emotion, your feeling? Yeah.
It helps the other person understand where you're coming from.
Love that. It helps the other person understand where you're coming from. Absolutely.
It reinforces just the need for communication. I think shows value.
Oh, it shows value. It reinforces, here's why we need to be talking about it, because here's the concern I have, and look, here's how I'm feeling. What else? Can you think of another reason why expressing your feelings might be valuable? Yeah.
Well, I would say you use that because in certain situations, for say, I'm having a conversation with my boyfriend, I'm going to express how I feel a little bit more than I would if I was having a counseling session with Sergeant Larson, for the simple fact that, although I have an invested interest in our relationship, it's a little bit more appropriate for me to talk to my boyfriend about my feelings because he cares about those because we're in an intimate kind of relationship.
Okay. So this day, remember, this unit about assertive communication, this is relationship day. That we're not only teaching the ideal model because it solves the problem. We're teaching the ideal model because it also strengthens the relationship. And when I express how I feel, that helps the other person know me better. That helps the other person understand why my concerns are what they are. So that it speaks to the relationship itself. Good. So that's the E. Now let's look at the A. So remember, A is to ask the other person for his or her perspective. And on the slide, it says to use what or how questions as opposed to why questions. So if I were speaking to Bob and I said, so, what was going on for you? How do you understand what this is all about versus why did you do that? What's the difference between what and how questions versus maybe a why question?
Again, you're making them defend themselves.
Okay, so why questions, when someone says, hey man, why did you do that? It sounds like an accusation. I mean, certainly my voice tone is communicating it's an accusation. And when you get accused, you probably like everyone else starts to want to defend. And the ideal model is about communicating openly. It's about having a conversation that strengthens the relationship. And so what questions and how questions tend to minimize defensiveness on the other person, whereas why questions tends to enhance. So we're going to help you to practice what versus how instead of those why questions. Now, you'll also notice it says to repeat back what you heard. So if I ask the other individual a question, why am I going to make it so that, why is it important so that we repeat back what the person said to us? I've asked a question, I've heard it, I'm going to repeat it back. What value is in the repeating back?
So there's no question about what's being discussed.
Right.
That we're confirming that's what in fact meant.
Right. It's a communications check. It's, I ask you a question, you say something, I listen, maybe paraphrase it a bit, but I put it back out there as an opportunity for the other individual to say, yep, you got it right, or no, that's not what I meant. So we can do course correction if what I repeat back isn't accurate. So it's a communications check. Good. Now that's the first part of the A. That's about bringing the other person into the conversation, and that's great because this is meant to be a conversation, not a monologue. And then there's a second A, to ask for a reasonable change. And you'll notice on the slide it says good faith. Circle good faith. Because what we mean there is, look, we're going to together, you and the other person together are going to craft the change that's necessary. And you might have to negotiate a little bit. You might ask for a change and the other person says, look, I'm sorry, I can't do that. So there might be some negotiation going on there. But the good faith is that the other individual needs to be able to agree to the change you're asking so that they could, in good faith, say, yep, I got that. I can do that. It's a reasonable change that the other person could actually agree to. So you want to make sure it passes what we're going to call the good faith test. And the last point under A, it says work to a win-win. We're going to do our best to make this a win-win. What does that mean, to make it a win-win? Why is that important in this model of assertiveness? Darling, what do you think?
Both people have a stake in it. Both people are able to buy into the process.
I love that. I love that you said both people have a stake in it, because that's exactly right. That this is about strengthening relationships, not just solving problems. And so if we're working towards a win-win, we're communicating that it's about us. You know, whether us is me and my husband or us is me and one of my soldiers, it's communicating that this relationship matters, so we're going to work hard together to make sure that we come to a resolution that we can both live with and that we'll both feel good about. Great. Last step, list. So remember, L is to list the positive outcomes that are going to occur, and that we're going to start with that. We're not promising that for every individual you communicate with, listing the positive is going to be the most motivating way to sort of wrap up the conversation. But we're going to start there. Hey, look, if we're able to do this for each other, here's the good thing that'll happen, because that builds positive emotion. It says, you matter to me and I want good. I want our relationship to be positive. And if that doesn't work, or if you know for a particular person that isn't going to be motivated, then sure, go ahead if necessary and talk about the negative consequences and negative outcomes that'll occur if the other person isn't able to make the change. And in the last part it says, consider appropriateness. There's lots of conversations that you all might have, maybe with your CO, or, it could be on the personal side of your life as well, where talking about the outcomes maybe isn't appropriate. Particularly in some professional settings, maybe you don't need to say, and look, if you're able to do this, here's the good thing that'll happen. It's just enough to be able to describe the problem and express some concerns and ask for a change, and you might not need to do that last step. So all of this, everything about this model is fluid, and what I mean by that is that you don't have to go through each of these steps in sequence. Each of these steps is just a guidepost. They're things for you to think about. Think about how you're going to describe the problem. Think about what your concerns are and how you're going to express it. But for any one conversation, you might go in a different sequence of the steps, or you might leave out one of the steps if you think that step isn't appropriate and isn't going to help further the conversation and further the relationship. So that's the ideal model. The ideal model helps to build assertive communication. And what you're going to do in just a bit is you're going to practice using the ideal model in a situation that matters to you. Before we do that, I want to answer any questions you have. So what questions do you have about the ideal model or assertive communication? Yeah.
I'm always going to get the outcome that I'm looking for in the assertive communication.
Oh, I love so the question is, if you follow these steps exactly as we describe, are we promising you that you'll always get the outcome you want? No, we're not. That's not real world. But here's what we know, that the assertive communication model, the ideal model, will increase the likelihood that the conversation will go well, that the other person will be engaged in the conversation with you, and because you're both in that conversation together, you have a better chance of finding a resolution that's positive. And here's the good thing, even if the conversation doesn't resolve the way you want it to, even if the problem doesn't get solved or the issue isn't completely squared away by the end of the conversation, you can at least go to bed that night knowing that you were confident, you were clear, you were controlled, and so you handled yourself in a way with integrity, so you're not going to have regrets about how that conversation went. You don't have regrets about, oh, I shouldn't have said that. And lastly, if the conversation goes well enough the first time because you weren't overly aggressive or overly passive, guess what? you have the opportunity to go back and have a second conversation. So it doesn't promise you the good outcome, but it increases the likelihood, and it certainly enables you to communicate in a way that keeps that relationship strong. Great question. Who else has got a question? Yeah.
I see how this would have great relevance in my civilian side of life, but as a leader, as a military leader, how can I really apply this without undermining my own authority or that of my subordinates?
Yeah. So the question is, all right, the statement is, look, I could use this at home with my kids, maybe with my spouse, but this isn't, you can't use this in my role as a leader. And I would push back on that. I would ask yourself the question, are there times as a leader, whether you're communicating to a subordinate or to someone higher up, where it's important for you to be confident, clear, and controlled? Now, in any one conversation, you might do more or less of one of these steps. So you might decide with your commanding officer, you're not going to express how you feel. Maybe that's not appropriate for you. But being confident, clear, and controlled means that you're keeping yourself, you're communicating in a way that says, I know what I'm about to say matters, and it's something that you should listen to. It says, look, I'm going to speak to you in a way that makes sure that this message doesn't get lost. And it says, I'm going to be paying close attention to how I'm speaking to you, and if I'm getting off track, I'm going to control myself. So I'm not going to say to you that every communication requires assertiveness. I don't think that's true. There's times where you might need to be more passive. There's certainly times where you might need to be more aggressive in a communication. But I don't think of this as just a personal skill. That whenever the answer is yes, I should be confident, yes, I should be clear, yes, I should be controlled, then I would say try out the ideal model. Who else? Question? Yeah, Suzanne.
How changeable is this really? I mean, I think this is personality.
Oh, great question. So Suzanne said, nice model you got there. But this stuff is hardwired, right? Like, you are born more of an aggressive person or more of a passive person. And so, maybe this stuff isn't really changeable. Look, it's true that in terms of temperament, some people are more temperamentally or more naturally perhaps aggressive in their way they engage in the world, or someone might be more shy or a little bit more passive in their personality. But we're not changing personality here. What we're doing is focusing on how do you speak? How do you communicate? And what we know is even someone who has a more aggressive personality, we're not trying to get rid of that. We're just saying, hey, look, when the situation calls for you to be assertive, confident, clear, and controlled, here's a model that with practice you can master. And what we find is that even when we work with really young kids, all the way through adulthood, with practice, emphasis on the with practice, people can master this model and speak in a way that's confident, clear, and controlled. Other questions?
Are there some steps that are a little more important than others? Because I kind of get the feeling that the identify part of the ideal model is a little bit more important than some of the other steps, because you really need to know the depth of what's really going on before you actually communicate that to someone.
Good. So are there any steps that are critical? I mean, look, you can do this model in a different order, although if you stay IDEAL, you get the acronym. I think you're right that you got, doing that I part. Remember, that's on your own time. That's the due diligence, thinking about the problem and making sure your own thinking traps and icebergs and all that other stuff isn't influencing your perception. I think you want to start there, because that also communicates to the other person, look, I did my homework. This matters enough to me that I spend 15 minutes or 20 minutes or 5 minutes ahead of time thinking it through. And you probably want to name the problem, describe the problem early in on the conversation so that the other person knows what you're talking about. But after that, you might, ask the other person's perspective before you express your concerns. There's no magic order. I think the sequence IDEAL makes the most logical, but these are real conversations. And so you can move around the steps to make sure that conversation is engaging and helpful to both people involved. All right. Any other questions? All right. So we just covered the ideal model of assertive communication, and I want to point out to you that it's an acronym and it's a twofer. So it's ideal, I will deal with you, and it's the ideal model, the best model of communication. Thank you.